Well, good morning. Today is Wednesday, September the 16th, and finally we have a beautiful day in Tampa Bay. We've had a lot of rain this past week, a lot of rain now up in the Panhandle as Hurricane Sally is hitting Pensacola area, and our thoughts go out to the Pensacola Christian College kids that are there. Now, we are continuing our chronological reading of the scriptures today. We've completed the book of Daniel. Now we open our Bibles to the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 1, 2, and 3, as we see God fulfilling his promise that Israel and Judah, the people, the Jewish people, would miraculously be returned to their homeland. Now you said, why is that a miracle? And the fact is that up until this point, all the nations that have been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and then by Cyrus of Persia, all of those nations have been assimilated into the culture of their conquerors. The land of Israel even has been resettled by people from other nations, which was the matter of really the conqueror maintaining control of the lands, the cities, and the fortresses that he had conquered. But as we come to Ezra chapter 1, there is a miracle. And that miracle is, in spite of the captivity that has lasted 70 years, there were 50,000 people, 50,000 of God's people, that rose up, hearing the news that Cyrus had made a declaration that the Jewish people could return to their homeland. His desire was to rebuild the temple. 50,000 rose up to return to Israel. Now, the sad news is that there were many more than 50,000 who chose not to return to the land of Judah, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and ultimately, and first and primarily, to rebuild the temple. Now, with that said, I want to introduce you to Ezra chapter 1, and I would say that Ezra 1 is a testimony that God is faithful to his promises. I have said this many times, and I'll say it again, that history is his story. That is God's story, a testimony of God's sovereignty and providential dealings with his people. Now, a little bit of the history. Solomon's temple was believed to have been completed in around 949 BC. In 722 BC, Israel, the northern 10 tribes, the northern kingdom, was conquered by Assyria. Then Nebuchadnezzar attacked and first subdued Jerusalem and Judah in 606 BC. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar took captive Judah's king Jehoiakim, along with several other young Jewish men. Among them was Daniel. In 606 BC, then, the date was the commencement of the 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah had prophesied in chapter 25, 9 through 11 of the book of Jeremiah. Now, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The Medo-Persian armies conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And so understand this, from the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar subduing Judah was 606 BC. In 536 BC, Cyrus of Persia has conquered Babylon, and within the first year of his reign, he made an edict that God's people, the Jewish people, would be allowed, permitted, set free to return to their homeland. In fact, I'm going to read Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And Cyrus proclaims these words. And he says, "Now the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build a house at Jerusalem," that is, a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Judah chapter 1, verse 3, the proclamation then was made that the Jews were set free to go back up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Verse 3, "Build the house of the Lord God of Israel." Now, there are two extraordinary events that you find in the opening verses of Ezra. The first is that God would move on the heart of a heathen king to actually finance the rebuilding of his temple, the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. And the second extraordinary event is that Cyrus would also issue an edict freeing the Jews to return to their homeland. Now, here's a word of encouragement to you. The same Lord who moved the heart of a pagan king to do his will is the same God who controls the heart of every authority in your life. King Solomon taught his son in Proverbs 21 and verse 1, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will." In other words, in our words, God is in control. Every authority that is in your life, whether it is an authority in our government, authority in your school, an authority in your church, an authority in your workplace, that just as God can take the heart of a king and turn it wherever his will would guide, God has that same power over every authority in your life if we'll only trust him. Now, after granting the Jews liberty to return to their homeland, less than 50,000 shared the vision and the heart for returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. With the exception of some priests and Levites, there were really only two tribes represented in those that went back to Judah, and that would be Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Judah. Now, we would ask, why only those two tribes? And the answer to that has to be that for those two tribes, only 70 years had passed from the beginning of the first captivity under Nebuchadnezzar until the edict of Cyrus. So only 70 years, really just one generation in a sense, maybe two generations. It could be argued if a generation is 30 or 35 years. But for Israel, the northern 10 tribes, they had been taken captive by Assyria 136 years earlier. And sadly, the testimony is that with the passing of years, the Babylonian culture had infiltrated, it seeded in the hearts of God's people. They had not only lost their love for Israel as a land, but they had also lost their love for the Lord. Their ancestry, as far as they were concerned, was the here and now. And Babylon being a type of the world, it leaves us with the challenge of where is our heart? The heart of God's people was no longer in Jerusalem. The heart of God's people was no longer with the Lord. But what about your heart? Matthew 6:19-21, the Lord taught his disciples, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, or where thieves do not break through and steal." Listen to this verse, Matthew 6:21, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." I wonder today, where is your treasure? A reminder to our church family. Tonight we began with our church family dinner at 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Cost for that is only $4 each per family member. At 6 o'clock, our teens began their activity time and Bible study. 6:15, Awana Clubs begins. 6:15 also, for the adults, we began with a time of prayer. And about 6:30, 6:35 or so, we actually began the lesson for tonight. I am teaching in the book of Proverbs. Tonight will be chapter 5. And if you've never done a verse-by-verse study, I'd invite you to be a part of us for that. My wife is teaching a class on ancient paths, looking at the challenge of the covenants that God had for his people in the Old Testament. And of course, Travis and Tanya Henry are also teaching a class for parents. I hope that you'll join us tonight. God bless you, my friends. Remember, where your treasure is, there is your heart also. God bless you. Bye-bye.